In this tutorial, we're going to be creating this 3D underwater scene entirely in After Effects. We'll take a look at how we can use the Cinema 4D render to generate true 3D titles, create fake caustics, break up the light pattern by adding what's called a Gobo in front of our light, add some floating particles that interact with a floor, then spice things up with some light rays, and finally composite some post-processing effects by first colorizing our shot with the color vibrance effect, then add this fisheye look, some glow, and because the Cinema 4D render doesn't support depth of field, we'll add it artificially with some neat tricks. There's a lot of useful information packed in this tutorial, but if you want to skip the work, then you can grab the customizable template on my Gumroad page, where you can also find project files from previous tutorials on the channel, which is a great way to support us, along with YouTube channel memberships, where you can actually find a tier that gives you access to all of those project files for free. And with all that said, let's jump right in and get started. We'll start by creating a new comp. We'll call it Underwater Tutorial. Resolution of 1080p, 30 frames per second, a duration of 15 seconds, and before we hit OK, we have to switch over to the 3D renderer and make sure we're using the Cinema 4D renderer. And by the way, you can see what's enabled and what's disabled when using this renderer, so that's something to keep in mind. And here under Options, we can set the quality to 10 so we can work a bit faster. And one more thing before we move on is to make sure we set the project to use 32 bits per channel. Now let's go ahead, create a new solid. We'll call it BG for background, make it black. And then we'll go ahead and grab the text tool and we'll type in underwater. We can hit Ctrl-Alt-Home to center the anchor point to the layer and then Ctrl-Home to center it to the composition. And first things first, we'll turn it into a 3D layer, which will give us the geometry and material options. Let's start by setting the extrusion depth to 50. So now we have some thick letters. And it will be a bit harder to see what we're doing for now. So let's just create a new light. We'll make it a point light, 100% intensity. We'll have it cast shadows and hit OK. Bring it in front, push it up a bit. Here you can see the bevel depth. No matter what we do to it right now, we won't see any changes because we have to first choose a bevel style. So I'll set it to convex. And let's say we rotate the title a bit. You can see what that's doing. So it just helps catch the light a bit more. So we'll set the bevel depth to 1 and then right click transform reset or use the Alt-R shortcut, which I have mapped to this function. Then we'll go over to this assets folder and we'll click and drag this HDRI into its own comp. I got this from polyhaven.com, which is completely free. And by the way, I'll make sure to leave links in the description for anything that we might mention throughout this tutorial. Now, before we continue, let's take a moment to thank today's sponsor, Envato Elements. Envato provides a huge library of creative assets such as graphic elements and templates, stock footage, music, sound effects, fonts, and much more. On top of that, it offers unlimited downloads with an affordable subscription. So if you're interested, I have provided a link down below in the description, which will take you to their website. And of course, if you do decide to register, I get to earn a commission. And I don't want any colors, so we'll add the tint effect by hitting Control Space to bring up FX Console, which is something I like to use instead of going through the menus or use the Effects and Presets panel. It is also completely free from videocopilot.net, so we search for an effect and then hit Enter to add it, and then we'll close it. Now we can bring that comp inside of here, and we'll call it HDRI. Then we'll turn it into a 3D layer as well, and then right-click and choose Environment Layer. So now when we go to the material options under the title, we can increase the reflection intensity, which will reflect that environment. And here you can notice that if we rotate the environment around, we can also tone down the sharpness if we want some softer reflections. But just keep in mind that depending on the quality, you might get very noisy results. So we can switch the quality to be 50% instead, and that will smooth out the reflection a lot. But anyway, we'll go back and set it to 10 just so we can move faster, and then Alt-R to reset the rotation. Let's also have the title cast shadows. And now we'll go ahead and create the ground. So layer, new solid, we'll call it ground, and we'll add the fractal noise effect. We'll switch the fractal type to dynamic progressive and the noise type to spline, and also invert it. By the way, these are just some settings that I played around with and I know work great. So, feel free to experiment. Then we'll we'll lower the complexity. We can also brighten it up a little bit. And then we'll add a vector blur with the amount set to 10, which will give us this sort of Caustics look. You can increase that, but just be aware that the higher you go, you risk getting artifacts. So we'll leave it at 10 for now. And then we'll turn it into a 3D layer. And let's hit W to bring up the rotation tool. Click on the X-axis, hold down Shift to snap it to -90. And I want the ground to be at the center of the world, which is 960 by 540 by 0 in a 1080p comp. But then we'll move the title up just a little bit, something like that. By the way, we can toggle this draft 3D, which will disable lighting, reflections, and all that, and allow us to move around a bit faster. I do want to scale up the ground a little bit more, so we'll hit S and let's say crank it up to about 250. And let's just make this point light into an ambient light so we can see things a bit better. Now, because we scaled up the ground, that means the texture is a bit too big. So we can go over to transform and then set the scale down to something like 20. But I do want to isolate the visibility of the ground to just a circular pattern in the middle. So instead of using masks, which can be a bit annoying to work with, especially if you're working with 3D layers, so we can do something like that and then maybe scale it down and feather it out. It's a bit tedious, and say we want to adjust it, it just takes a bit too long. So instead we'll add the circle generator effect, but we'll set the blending mode to stencil alpha, so it's just used as a mask, and then we'll increase the radius a little bit. But then under feather, we can feather this out like crazy. But let's just make sure the radius doesn't go too far off so we don't see the cutout. And now we'll duplicate the ground and we'll call this one surface. And then we'll push it all the way up so it sits above our title. Let me switch to draft and let's say something like that. But then we can push it back in Z space and then also scale it up to about 1000 so it covers more of the view. Maybe push it back even more. By the way, if you find it hard to orbit around and see things, well, first of all, you can go ahead and select the title, for example, and then go over to View and choose Look at Selected Layers. I also have a shortcut map to it, which you can do by going over to Edit, Keyboard Shortcuts. So let's click on that, and that will focus the camera onto our title. And then before you move around, just make sure you click and hold on the Orbit tool and switch to Orbit Around Camera Point of Interest. So it doesn't matter where you click, it's gonna orbit around the camera's point of interest, which we can bring up if we had a camera. So we'll go ahead, create a new camera at this point, and we'll make it very wide, 15 millimeters, hit OK. And now we can orbit around. And if we hit A, we can bring up the point of interest and also hit P on the underwater title. We can hit Control-Alt-Home to center the anchor point to it and then copy the position, paste it to the point of interest of the camera. So now we know that it's gonna orbit perfectly around our title. By the way, I'm holding Alt left click to orbit, Alt middle click to move, and then Alt right click to dolly in and out. But also make sure that these are all set to work around the point of interest by clicking and holding down on the other options. And while we're here, you can also see that you get these two options that are the extended viewer, which allow you to see past the camera view. And then you can hold down on this option and just increase or decrease the opacity. We'll turn it off, and you also have the grid, so you can see where the floor of the world is. So those are some very cool ways to navigate the 3D scene in After Effects. Now back to our surface, we'll go ahead and increase the radius a little bit more, and we'll turn off Draft 3D. Now let's go ahead and focus on the lighting. So we'll select the ambient light, go over to light settings, which you can do by hitting Control-Shift-Y, and we'll switch this to be a spotlight. Leave the cast shadows on, hit OK. And now we can switch to, say, the front view, and then we'll push up this light and then bring the point of interest to the center of the title. We can also go to the left view. To make it easier to move this, we can deselect it, just click away, and then click and drag on this middle point. So now you can move the light, but not the point of interest. And we can set the cone angle to about 100 degrees just to make sure it covers the entire scene, and then switch back to the active camera. And you can see that the look has kind of changed, and that's because the surface layer does take into account this light. So if it's not being affected by the light, then it's going to show up as dark. So we want to go down to material options and set the accept lights to off. We don't want that surface layer to be affected by any lights in our scene. As for the ground, and by the way, let me just organize this a little bit. We'll set the ground at the bottom, surface at the top. Then there's the HDRI, spotlight, camera, and that's okay. And we'll drop down the ground settings under material options. We'll set the specular intensity to 0, so it doesn't get brightened up by the light, but then we'll increase the spotlight intensity to about 200%. And now to break up the light a little bit more, we'll go ahead and duplicate the ground layer and we'll call this Gobo. A Gobo, by the way, is something you put in front of your lights, even in real life, which is usually like a tree texture or something, so that it breaks up the light and gives you a more interesting shadow pattern on your scenes. We'll turn off 3D for now and also the transparency so we can see what's going on. And let's also reset the scale to 100%. First of all, let's delete the circle. We don't want to isolate this texture. Then we'll go over to the evolution options and just change the random seed a little bit. We'll also tone down the brightness and also set the scale to 10. We want even more detail. Now we do want to use a levels effect to crush the blacks, so we're left with only the white areas. And then we'll add the extract effect, which will allow us to key out the dark parts. And by the way, you can see this if we toggle the transparency grid. So whatever is black, we're cutting it off with the black point threshold, but then we can smooth it out just a little bit by dragging the second point over. And now we can turn this into a 3D layer, unsolo it. And now to quickly and easily put it in the same spot as the spotlight, we can parent it while holding Shift. You can see that's what it says here. Hold Shift to move layer to location of parent. And now that jumps up all the way there. And then with the Gobo selected, I can hit Z to have the camera jump to it. We can also turn off the underwater title just so we can render things a bit faster. And now with the Gobo selected, hit P and just shift it in Z local space. So it moves just in front of that light. But then we do need to scale this down quite a bit. So let's say 2%. And then we'll move it back close to the light. Maybe let's say 3%, just to make sure that it covers the entire light radius. Let's say 4% instead. And then we can select the camera, Alt-R to reset it, and then move around the scene. Turn on the underwater title. We'll go ahead and hit Z on it. And now with the light selected, just so we can see what the Gobo is doing a bit more clearly, let's crank up the shadow darkness to 200% and then lower the shadow diffusion. We have to make sure that the cast shadows is on for the Gobo. And there we have the breaking pattern. Now we do need to bring up the shadow diffusion to about 50, so it softens it up a little bit. But you can see the difference is very, very nice indeed. We just get a bit of a more interesting look instead of just a flat light coming from above. And that also adds to the fake Caustics effect. By the way, if you want to soften this up a little bit more, you can go ahead and add a Gaussian blur effect to it. And let's say do about 25%. But I think without it, it's just fine. Also, to introduce even more detail, you can scale it down even more to 5% on the fractal noise. So, you know, just keep those in mind. You can play around with all of these values. Nothing is really set in stone. Just because I say do this doesn't mean that you have to follow step by step. Now let's rename the spotlight and then we'll duplicate it. We'll hit Ctrl-Shift-Y to bring up its settings and then switch this to an ambient light first of all, with the intensity set to about 50%, just so we brighten up those shadows a little bit. And then duplicate it one more time. We'll call this backlight and then switch it to a point light with no shadow casting, because then we'll have double shadows. So, and then let's say also an intensity of 50%. We'll hit Control-Home to center it to the comp. We can bring it over to the back and then push it up just a little bit. So now we can see that light affecting the back side of our title. And by the way, I think the title's highlights are a bit too harsh. So one thing we can do is go under the text properties, under animate, which you would think is normally just for animating. Well, we also have these options, which allow us to assign different properties to the side, back, bevel, or front. So for the side, we'll go ahead and add an RGB color, and we'll set it to be 25% black. So that's going to be quite dark, and then hit OK. So now we have a darker edge, or a darker side rather. And by the way, you're not limited to just controlling the color. You can go ahead and add other properties. Let's say for the side, I don't want it to be reflective at all. So I can assign a reflection intensity, which will override this value down here under material options, which controls the reflection intensity for the entire title. But I do want reflections on the side. And by the way, we can set the metal down to 50%, which will give us sort of an in-between look. And if you find that the HDRI is a bit too intense, you can't really decrease the opacity. That won't do anything. Instead, what we have to do is we'll lock the composition viewer, and then we'll go inside of the HDRI, and then we'll switch back here. So with this layer selected inside of the HDRI composition, by the way, we can rename that comp. We can make changes to this layer and then see it update on the main comp. So we'll duplicate the tint effect, have them both set to black, and then just lower the amount to tint to about 50%, which we can see what's happening if we go over to the HDRI composition. It's as if we're adding a black solid with 50% opacity on top of this layer. And that's a way you can control the intensity of the HDRI, but let's just leave it at 25% instead. For the most part, I want the title to be a bit brighter compared to the surrounding environment, so we can have the focus mainly be on the title itself. All right, now we can start adding some animation. So let's make some room. We'll create a new null object. We'll make it 3D, and we'll call it camera control. I usually like to use null objects just because it makes it a bit easier to work with cameras. And what we'll do is bring up the camera point of interest, the position of the underwater title, make sure the point of interest is sitting on the position of the title, and then copy the point of interest and paste it to the position of the null camera control, and then finally parent the camera to the camera control. So now when we go to rotate this null, it's gonna rotate around that point of interest. So what can we do? Let's set a keyframe for the Y rotation. And by the way, we can hit Shift S to bring up the scale while keeping the other properties visible, and then scale it up, which will in turn dolly out the camera just until we can see the entire title, and then hold down Shift, hit P to bring up the position as well. So we'll set a keyframe for the position, scale, and Y rotation. We'll crank up the scale so the camera is sitting very far away, and then we'll rotate it to the side like this. And then we'll move over to 5 seconds, let's say. We'll set the scale down to 110, and then we'll rotate it over to the other side. But at the same time, we need to shift the position so we keep the title centered at all times. We can even bring up the title action save and then use those guides just to make sure it's sitting roughly in the center, and then go back at the beginning and then move it over here. But I do want to orbit the camera itself. So we got this low angle. Now over here at the beginning, we do want to push it over to the right a little bit more. So you can see how fast you can make very sweet looking camera animations by parenting your camera to a 3D null object instead of animating the camera itself. Because now we can just change this without ruining our animation. And by the way, I want to go even lower, so something like that. But now we're cutting through the ground, so we can select the position itself on the null and just make sure you're sitting on one of the keyframes. And now we can just bring up the Y value, which will kind of affect everything. So, okay, well, maybe not here. We still have to push it up at the beginning. And now we can switch off draft 3D. Go back to full, see how that looks like. And by the way, you can notice how the Gobo is breaking up the lighting on the title. So this E letter is a bit more in shadow compared to the T letter. So that's a very nice effect. Now let's go ahead and add some particles. So we'll create another new solid, call it particles. And we'll use the CC particle world effect, which it comes with After Effects. And right away, we'll shut off the grids and guides. We don't need to see those. Then we'll go over to the particle. And I want to switch the particle type to a faded sphere. You can also choose a bubble, but I don't think that makes sense in this case. I just think that the faded sphere looks a bit better. Then we can set both the colors to be white. Then we'll set the max opacity to 50% and then increase the size variation to 100. As for the size, let's alt click on the depth size so we can parent it to the birth size, and that way we only have to worry about one of those values. So let's say 0.05, and then let's go ahead and crank up the longevity, which is the lifetime of the particles, to about 50 seconds so they never disappear. But just keep in mind that because of the opacity map having this fade in and fade out, you might not be able to see the particles properly. So just click and hold and fill that entire map in. And then we'll enable the birth rate stopwatch, bring it at the beginning, and we'll set the first keyframe to 50, move over for about a second, set it down to 0. So from this point on, we won't be emitting any more particles. By the way, just to move faster, we can solo the particles layer. And then under physics, I want to remove the gravity so they don't fall down, but also tone down the velocity to 0.1 so they don't move too fast. And I want to trim this layer to the last keyframe and then push this over to the start. So as soon as we begin the animation, we already have particles visible in the scene. Now we can switch to the custom view, turn on draft 3D. We'll unsolo this and also switch to quarter. And with the underwater title selected, we can hit Z to focus. What I want to do is have these particles be contained in between the surface and the ground. So let's select the particles. We'll go over to the producer and we'll move the position Y on the minus. You can sort of eyeball where the producer position needs to be. And then let's increase the radius X so it covers a lot more horizontally. And then also radius Y, so we get some more depth. As for the radius Y, we don't want to go too crazy because then we could go through the surface and ground. So let's bring that back down. And I'm thinking the velocity is a bit too high still, so let's do 0.05. And then we can bring this back up. Another thing we can do is go over to the floor, and just so we can see what's going on, we can toggle the grid so we can see the floor. And then we can set this floor position to be 0. So that's going to sit on the same exact spot as our ground. And then set the floor action to bounce, which will make the particles bounce back up as soon as they hit the ground. And you can see that a bit better if we zoom in here. Let me solo this. So look at this particle. They hit the ground and they move back up. And we can control the bounciness, intensity, let's say set it to 50. As for the randomness, I want that down to 0 because if we leave it to anything higher than 0, there is a chance that a particle might hit the floor but not bounce back. So I don't want that. And then also we can increase the bounce spread to 100 so the particles will hit and then fly off in another direction. I may want to push this even further just to give it some more time to pre-run. And then we can drag this out and trim it here at the beginning with Alt open square bracket. And now let's unsolo. And because the particles can't really interact with the title in terms of depth, what we have to do is push these back in the Z space. Let's just turn off the grid now and have the majority of them sit behind the title. And we'll call these particles background. But even still, if we go in front, you can see that the particles are going to render on top of the title. That's because the layer itself is sitting on top in the layer stack. And if we go ahead and bring it underneath the underwater title, that will work, but that will ruin the Gobo because now you see how this outline is contained within these two 3D objects, and then there's another outline contained with all these other 3D objects. That means that these guys are no longer working together in the same 3D space because the particle background 2D layer is splitting them apart. So you can see if I bring this back up at the top, the Gobo and the shadow on the ground and everything is now rendering together. But with that in between, it will ruin everything. So how do we make the particles render behind the title while at the same time not ruining the 3D layer stack? Well, we can use the set matte effect. We can choose the underwater title and then invert the matte. You see now if we solo the underwater title and the particles, with the set matte, they render behind. And then we'll duplicate the particles and we'll rename this one to particles foreground. So we can now push them in front. Go over to the producer, push the position Z in front like so. And then the radius Z as well, we can tighten that up. So we can bring it back. Also, we can hit U to bring up the keyframes and then hit this left arrow, which will allow us to quickly move to the first keyframe. And we'll set the birth rate to about 10 instead. So there's fewer particles at this point in time. By the way, if you notice any glitches in some frames, you might have something rendering from a previous part of the tutorial. That means that the cache is kind of messed up. So you want to go to Edit, Purge, All Memory, and Disk Cache, and then hit OK. So that now every frame that's going to be saved to the cache will be done so with new settings. And we can bring it in even closer. And for this one, we don't want to use the set matte effect. We want these to render on top of our title. And here now from this first frame, you can see that the particles aren't nearly covering enough of the space, so we can increase the radius Y and the radius X. Do the same on the particles background. You can switch to full, by the way, and turn off draft 3D so you can see exactly what the particles look like. And the particles in the background might be a bit too small, so let's just do 0.1 instead. And I'm thinking the camera is zoomed out a bit too much, so let's just do 160 on the scale at the start. And also the particles in the background might be a bit too dense, so we'll go back to the first keyframe and we're gonna half the birth rate. So 25, okay, that's looking a bit better. And perhaps even lower back the birth size to 0.75, so that's a nice in between. Let's go ahead and add the light rays. And the way we're gonna do that is by making the surface blur out with the CC radial fast blur effect. But if we were to add it right now and then set the center to something like there, and then increase the amount to about 90, and we can see that it's kind of being cut off. So let's go ahead and delete the effect first of all. We'll go ahead and pre-compose this, Control-Shift-C, and we'll move all attributes, hit OK. And now the 3D is gonna break because this is now no longer 3D and there is no camera inside of this pre-comp. So we can collapse the transformations by clicking this box over here. And now this layer will take into account the camera in our main comp. But now we can go ahead and add the CC radial fast blur effect and increase the amount to about 90. And if we move the center point, now it's no longer being cut off. But we do need to control the texture a little bit. So we'll go ahead and add the curves effect. And first of all, let's just crush the blacks and then increase the whites. And then we'll bring the radial blur underneath, we'll turn it on, we'll set the first one to be brightest, we'll duplicate it, we'll set it to be standard, and finally let's also add a Gaussian blur and we'll leave this right after the curves so we can kind of soften the texture a little bit so there's no jitter going on. And now we can unsolo it, we'll bring it at the top and we'll set the blending mode to add. The blur might be a bit too much, so let's tone it down to 10 and then also increase the contrast. And then I also want the light rays to not render on top of the title. So again, we'll use a set matte effect and have it take the matte from the underwater title and invert it. So now the light rays are only gonna show up behind the title. But now we have another problem. So let's solo it and let's just move around. You can see that the light ray direction doesn't really update. So how do we fix this? Let's say animate the center values on both of these, like have them come in from this side when the camera is over here. And then when it moves over here, we can have them animate, move over to the other side. That's a bit tedious and takes quite a bit of time, especially if we go ahead and change the camera animation. So let's go ahead and create a new null object. We'll make it 3D and we'll call it rays control. Then with the surface selected, we'll alt-click on the center, we'll parent it to the rays control, and now before we let go, we'll type in .2comp, open parentheses, open square bracket, 0, 0, 0, and then click away. And actually, let's copy this expression, alt-click on the other effect, and then Control-V to paste. So now what we've done is we've linked the center value to this 3D null object. So you can see how it updates. Wherever we move this, that's where the light rays are shooting from. And what we can do is hit P. Let's first of all just Control Home to center it. We can push it way back in Z space, and I'm talking like a lot. We can hold Shift as we increase this value to go in higher increments, so we can move it back very quickly. And then we'll bring it up So now, regardless of where the camera is, the light rays are going to render properly. Now, one thing that you might have noticed is that the surface itself is gone, and that's because I actually forgot to keep a copy of it. So we'll duplicate the surface, hit Ctrl-Shift-E to remove all of its effects, and then we'll actually bring it underneath the ground. Switch to full, just so we can see how that looks like in full glory. And by the way, as it is right now, the surface light rays are being cut off by the title, so they render behind. But if you want to, you can set the set matte to be first on the effects stack, which will cut off the title from the surface. We can then give it some contrast and then introduce the light rays, which will make it render a bit more realistically. So you can see now the title itself is kind of creating some shadows in the volume, which I think is a bit more realistic. But just keep in mind that this is now rendering on top of some parts of the letters. So we can go over to the underwater title and then set the fill color, so the original color, to be a bit darker, but I still think it's a bit too much. So we'll go ahead and set the opacity to 75% for the rays. That just tones down the brightness on those parts a little bit. But I really like how the light rays are being broken up by the letters. And now let's finally start making this look pretty. So we'll go over to the project panel, let's drag and drop this into another new comp, and we'll call this composite. We'll start by adding a new adjustment layer, and we'll call this fisheye. So I want to introduce a sort of wide angle look to the entire thing, because the 3D camera in After Effects, even though it's a very wide angle lens, it doesn't give us any distortion that you would normally get with a fisheye lens. So to fake that, we're gonna add a Bezier warp effect first of all. Hit Ctrl-Shift-H to toggle the UI element so we can see what's going on. And I want all these four corners to be pushed by 60 pixels. So on the top left vertex, we'll set the second value to 60, right top vertex to 60 as well. Then bottom right vertex will minus 60 from 1080, and left bottom vertex will minus 60 from 1080 as well. So now we have this curve along the corners. And also let's increase the quality to 10 so we get rid of any aliasing issues. Then we'll add the CC lens effect. We'll start by setting the size to 100 and then go in the negative with the convergence to, let's say, minus 50. And now we get this fisheye look, which looks pretty cool in my opinion, but we do have the issue of the surrounding area being black. So we'll add a transform effect. And now we have to scale this back up until we get rid of all those black areas. So let's say 140. And the scale is really dependent on how much you distort the image. So if you have less convergence, you might not need to scale it up as much. So it's all up to you, but I want a very intense fisheye look, so we'll leave it as is. And now you can see how cool it looks as we get close to the title. We get this sort of bent look, which is very nice indeed. And by the way, if you want to, you can copy this back to the main comp and paste it on top. So you can see how it's gonna look like with the fisheye as you're animating the camera. Because say you don't have the fisheye adjustment layer and you get quite close to the title, well, when you go to turn on the fisheye in the composite comp, you might cut off the text. So that's just something to keep in mind. But let's Control-C to undo and go back. And we'll make sure that we right-click and set this to be a guide layer. So we can see the effect that it has in this comp, but it's not going to show up in the composite comp, because then we would have double the fisheye effect. And now we'll duplicate this, hit Ctrl-Shift-E to delete all of its effects. And then we'll rename it to Turbulence. And we'll add the Turbulent Displacement effect. We'll set the mode to be turbulent smoother, and then we'll set the size to about 20 and also the amount to 10. We don't want too much displacement. We want this to be very subtle. And now to give this whole thing some life, instead of having everything be super static, instead of animating things manually, we can alt click on the evolution and type in time times 250. So now there's going to be some constant turbulence and make it look like we're underwater. And then we'll do the same with the ground, Gobo, and the surface. So alt click on the evolution, time times 100 for these, and we can Control-C to copy and then go over to the Gobo, alt click, Control-V to paste, and then go inside of the surface pre-comp, alt click there, and then Control-V to paste. So now we have movement across the entire scene. Keep in mind that you can increase the speed of the evolution on the surface, on the ground, if you want to. Now we'll duplicate the turbulence and we'll rename this one to Colorization. We'll add the VC Color Vibrance effect, which is not built into After Effects, but it is totally free and it's also from Video Copilot. So let's just choose a sort of a bluish color and we'll tone down the vibrance a little bit. We don't want it to be too saturated. Then we can play around with the gamma. Then we'll go ahead and add a tint effect, and actually we'll bring this up before the tint and we'll map the black to be a bit brighter. So now we make it seem like there's a bit of fog instead of everything being pitch black at the back there. And now we can tone down the brightness a little bit and also the gamma if you want some more contrast. But I'll actually add a curves effect to add some more contrast like that. And then a vignette effect. We'll pin the highlights so it doesn't affect any highlights. Maybe tone down the amount a little bit and also the angle of view. Now we'll duplicate the colorization, delete the effects once again, and we'll rename this glow, and we'll add a glow effect. We'll increase the threshold a little bit, set the intensity to 0.1, and then increase the radius quite a lot. Because of the glow effect, things are starting to blow up a bit more. So let's go back and decrease the brightness. And then we'll duplicate the glow. We'll decrease the threshold to about 50, but then increase the radius to 1000. So we have this very soft, smooth glow. In fact, let me just increase the threshold a little bit so it doesn't affect too much of our scene. You can also move forward or backwards in time just to see what kind of look you get. And I actually don't mind some areas being blown up a little bit, so yeah. Then we'll duplicate the glow and we'll call this one Chromatic Aberration. And we'll use Quick Chromatic Aberration 3 from Plugin Everything, which is also not built in, but it is totally free. So we'll set the position to about 2. In fact, let's switch to full so we can see this a bit better. And then under stylistic, we can increase the blur to about 20. See, it's very subtle, but it gives a very cool effect. And then we'll do noise. I'll use noise HLS auto. We'll set the noise to grain, 3% on the lightness, grain size of 0.5, and then speed 30 since we're using 30 frames per second. And that just gives it a little bit of texture. And I'm thinking we'll go over to the colorization, maybe bring up the blacks a little bit more so it's not too contrasty. So now we finally reached the end result, but there are a couple of things missing, which are the motion blur and the depth of field. Unfortunately, if you use the Cinema 4D renderer, you can't have motion blur in your scenes, and also depth of field is not supported for your cameras. So we're gonna have to add artificial motion blur or depth of field. For motion blur, I usually like to use the Real Smart Motion Blur plugin, which is pretty fast and yields pretty cool results, but you have to pay for it. Whereas if you use the built-in CC Force Motion Blur effect, you might get kind of good results, but it renders super slow. Oh my God, look at this. Look, let it render for some time. Yeah, I don't have time for this. I'll just delete it. But we'll skip the motion blur. So I would recommend that unless you have the Real Smart Motion Blur plugin, which doesn't really cost too much, then don't use motion blur for this project. As for the depth of field, a workaround I found is to duplicate our comp. We'll call it depth map, and then let's solo it. And we'll add the 3D channel extract effect, which allows us to extract a depth map from our 3D layers inside of After Effects. So now what we can do is set the black point to be a bit lower, but you can see that it's not working quite right. I mean, the title, the bottom, and the top parts are working well, but then we got this blown out white area right in the middle. And that's because even though we have a black solid in the background in our main comp to fill in that area so there's no transparency, it is still 2D. So After Effects doesn't really know what that is. So it just assumes it's pure white. It's like super close to camera. So to fix it, we can duplicate the backgrounds. We have a backup original copy. We'll turn this background into a 3D layer. So we'll push this back until it no longer intersects with our top surface part. So it's way back in the distance, and then hit S. We'll scale it up until it covers the entire view. Hit R, by the way, you can hold down Control to rotate this in finer increments. And then you can also move it over here. We just want this to cover the entire view. Scale it up just a little bit more and then parent it to the camera. So now regardless of where the camera looks, we'll still have that background layer covering the entire background. And now when we go back to the composite comp, you can see now we have a proper result. We solo that out for a moment, and then we can tweak the black point and also increase the white point to make the letters a bit brighter. Then we'll shut it off, bring back the visibility of the original comp, set this to full, and now we'll duplicate the fisheye, let's say, delete its effects, we'll bring it at the bottom and call it depth of field, and we'll use the camera lens blur effect and set the blur map layer to be the depth map with effects and masks, so it takes into account the 3D channel extract effect. Now this does render quite slow, so let's set the shape to square, but then increase the roundness to 100% to get circular bokeh, and then increase the radius to about 10. It is still not working properly, so let's set the blur focal distance to maybe 1 or something. Bring it down a little bit. Maybe the radius is a bit too much, so let's say 5. And another thing we can do is set the aspect ratio to 0.5, so the bokeh becomes oval shaped as if we're using an anamorphic lens. Now keep in mind that this method is a bit too finicky. Sometimes you might run into some glitches where it doesn't render properly. And I would say don't go over radius of 10, because then you get these weird artifacts where it's glowing around the edges of the title, which I think in this case actually looks pretty sick. It's a very stylized look, but that's actually an artifact with using a depth map and the camera lens blur effect. Now we can shut this off, and I want to point out that there are 2 other third-party paid tools that allow you to introduce artificial depth of field, which is Depth of Field Pro from Richard Rosenman. And here we can choose a depth map with effects and masks, and then increase the aperture size to about 2, maybe let's say 15 actually. And then we can even set the focus by picking this and just clicking on the title, which is very intuitive actually. And this actually gives you a much cleaner result. You see, you don't get those artifacts around the edges. You get a much better looking depth of field effect. Another alternative you have is the Frischluft depth of field, I believe. So if we find that over here, and then it's the same thing, just select the depth map, effects and masks, increase the radius, and then select the depth point. But this one actually don't own, so you can see we got this cross, which is the demo version, but this is just for the purpose of showing you, so we'll delete it, and we'll delete this one, and we'll turn the camera lens blur effect back on, and we'll just lower the blur radius, just for the sake of not having those edges be too distracting. But now if you look at the difference without depth of field and then with, it just gives the shot a lot more depth. Of course, you can go ahead and go back to the main comp, say change this to whatever we want, even use a different font. You can tweak the lighting, the Gobo texture, change the HDRI, maybe rotate it even, or even add your own camera animation. Heck, you can even animate the title itself to either scale up, move into position, use the animate properties here. There's also some presets. If you go over to Window, Effects and Presets, you can look for animation presets under text, 3D text, and I believe there's this one that looks pretty cool, 3D resolve position. So just drag and drop that into your title, and then we can solo it out, switch to quarter. So you can see this kind of comes in like that. Alternatively, if you want to add your own logo, you're gonna have to import it as an Illustrator file and then convert it into shapes, and then copy that layer over to your main comp. We'll turn it into a 3D layer. Hold down Shift and parent it to the underwater title so it jumps to its own position, and then unparent it. Let's just change the fill color to white, and then we can hit the tilde key to maximize the timeline, and then we'll drop down the properties here. We'll select the geometry options, hit Ctrl+C, paste it here, copy the materials, paste it here, and now we can hide the underwater and then scale down the logo. So now the logo is using the same settings as the underwater title, but instead of using text, we now use a custom shape, which is my logo in this case. And now to render, just make sure you first off set the quality to be at least 50, and I would advise you don't go over that because it's diminishing returns. The quality isn't really gonna increase much, but the render time is gonna nuke your computer. So let's just make sure it's set to 50, hit OK, and then we'll hit Ctrl+M to add to render queue. And I would advise in projects like these where it takes very long to render things out and there's a high chance of crashing, I would say set this to render as an image sequence, either PNG or OpenEXR. I like to use OpenEXR to retain the highest quality possible. In the compression, I set it to DWAA, hit OK, set the destination, and then hit render. And if you want to skip the labor, you can grab this as a template on my Gumroad page so you can customize it for your own projects. There you can find project files from previous tutorials on the channel, which is a great way to support us, along with channel memberships on YouTube, where you can actually find a tier that gives you access to all project files for free. Alright guys, so thanks for watching and being patient all the way through, because I know that it wasn't really a short tutorial, but I wanted to cover as much as possible, and hopefully you were able to get some value or at least some entertainment out of this. Thank you once again for watching, and I will see you next time. Peace out.